welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy and very pleased to bring the conversation I had with Katlyn Carter. Katlyn is a historian and assistant professor in history at the University of Notre Dame. Much of her research is on the origins of modern representative democracy through the study of political practices and institutions. She has a bachelor's in history from the University of California, Berkeley, PhD in history from Princeton University, and she is the author of Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy and Transparency in the Age of Revolutions, which is what we discuss. It's a fantastic book, and I was very happy to talk with her about many of the themes that she brings out. We start by talking about the concern that many people in the United States have about secrecy and transparency in government. We talk about the differences between representative governments and representative democracy, pros and cons of democracy, and how democracy is different and also not different than it was in 1776. We talk about shifting from colonies to states, reasons for secrecy in the founding, comparisons with France and the French Revolution, Madison's speed bumps for democracy, how we see transparency now in government, and many other topics. This was such a fun conversation to have. She's super brilliant and super wonderful. I'm looking forward to all of the work that she will continue to do. I highly recommend her book. It's always evergreen. And as always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. Also on YouTube. Share, like, subscribe, contribute, all the things. And now I bring you Katlyn Carter. I am here with Katlyn Carter. Katlyn, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So you've written a really awesome book. I greatly enjoyed it. As I was telling you before we started, I didn't know how much I didn't know about this. So now it's completely colored how I look at some of the periods in the founding of the country, which is interesting. So it's a great book. Really puts a spotlight on things. The book is called Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy and Transparency in the Age of Revolutions. How did you get to this book? So maybe you can tell us your academic and professional background, and then how you got to this book.
Yeah, well, I should say thank you very much. I appreciate that. I came to this book. I was always interested in history, but after I graduated college, I went and I worked in DC for a couple of years, and I was doing media relations, mostly for issue-based campaigns and things like that. And I just got really interested in the relationship between elected officials and the people, public opinion, their constituents, and kind of thinking about how representatives thought about that relationship when they're making policy decisions, and to what extent did they feel like they needed to consult and try to reflect public opinion and what they did, to what extent did they feel like they needed to vote their conscience, so to speak, on issues and try to tune that out.
Yeah.
And I was really interested in the role of the media in facilitating that relationship between the public and elected officials. So I was kind of engaged in that. I was thinking about these questions. I knew I wanted to go back to graduate school and study history. And I thought, I'm going to go back to the origin of modern representative democracy in the late 18th century and look at how they thought about these questions back then when they were setting this whole thing up. So that's kind of what led me to the topic. And then when I got there and started digging into the sources, it's kind of like you were saying after you read the book, I just started to see this everywhere. So I started to see anxieties about state secrecy were just so prominent, and these kind of discussions about having more transparency in government and questions of what that meant, what that would look like. I just noticed that these are really prominent, and I thought, we need to better understand this if we want to understand representative democracy and sort of how it was set up and how it works.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, there's plenty of things to say about why this is important generally. Of course, it's always evergreen for our current age, right? When we think about democracy, there's that very, I don't know if it's dramatic, but that whole, Washington Post kind of, democracy dies in darkness kind of thing. But I guess democracy is created in darkness, is what's kind of the point that you're making. So, so you make this really interesting kind of comparison throughout the book of sorts between the United States in the founding and France and their revolution that they had as well, and how that contrast in the beginning is pretty different. So the Constitutional Convention was behind closed doors, whereas in France, early on, there was in the presence of crowds and a lot of publicity. So I guess the general question, we can come to those, of course, but why, what is this like kind of, I guess, obsession of sorts of like transparency, right? We need to have government transparent, right? As if you're doing things outside of our will, or, there's always this fear of government doing things behind our backs or something like that. But yeah, tell us about, like, I guess these ideas of secrecy and transparency in creating government, and why we care about that and why it's important to understand.
Yeah, so a few things that makes me think of a few things. One is that the reason that I think it's important to understand is actually comes about through looking at a comparative case, which I do in the book. So, as you just noted, I look at the United States and I look at France. And in the United States, when the framers met to write the Constitution in 1787, they shut the doors, they met under oath of secrecy. To write that document and then put it out, published it to be considered in the ratifying debates. In France, it's a very different process. They convene as the Estates General, which is at the invitation of the king. They quickly turn themselves into the National Assembly, so a sitting legislature, and they set about writing a constitution in France for the first time. And they do that with an audience. They do that with open doors. There are many more deputies. There's 1,200 deputies there participating in this process, whereas in the United States, you had 55 framers meeting in Philadelphia. So these are big differences. And what I found through writing the book is that I think that those procedural questions, those questions of the size of a room, the size of a body that's meeting, the presence of an audience or of reporters, they make a big difference in terms of how those meetings function and what people are kind of conceptualizing or thinking their delegates, their representatives should be doing, or how they should kind of act on behalf of the people. So just having that comparison, I think, helps highlight the significance of those kind of procedural decisions about what's going to be done in public or in the open versus what's going to be done behind closed doors. It kind of shapes the nature of the way people think about those institutions, those legislative bodies, deliberative bodies. And it also has an effect on what they're able to do, or kind of the outcome of their deliberations.
What's the I guess you would say the ripple effect of this, right? In terms of how we still do these things. So if we think about for the United States, we still see a lot of these things happening. I guess one kind of example that pops to mind is, obviously we have various committees that don't always get televised, and you got to get out of committee first, and maybe you'll get it to the floor in terms of the Senate and the House. But I remember in a couple of years ago when everyone was kind of sort of trying to understand or figure out which side they were on with this whole TPP kind of thing, right? And everyone was crying about how we haven't even read the bill, and this is all done in secret, and everything's just getting there, and all these things. Like, that's just a modern example. But the question I have is how much of how in this case a country, but how these organizing bodies do things at the beginning when they're forming kind of shape the legacy of how they continue to work 250 years later in the United States case.
Sure. Well, I mean, I argue in the book that it has a profound effect on the sort of legitimacy of the founding itself as an act of popular sovereignty, and this kind of at least in the case of the United States, having formed that document behind closed doors, having the notes from those sessions so long held under wraps and not publicly available. And then even when they are, the limitations that are posed by those sources in terms of being able to know exactly what was said or how different compromises were reached or deals were cut, all those kind of limitations did contribute, I think, to giving kind of a sense of disembodied unanimity to this document. Rather than seeing it as something that was a very human process and a result of politics, that it kind of gives it that aura of disembodied, emerged from this meeting whole, and it's hard to kind of dig into in that way. And it had that effect, even from the very beginning. It made it harder for anti-federalists who might have been against the Constitution, for example, to level critiques at it, because they didn't, it was presented to them wholesale. They didn't have any insight into how it was exactly formed or what was coming, right? So that kind of put them immediately in a defensive position and made it kind of harder to argue against or kind of resist that. So I argue in the book that the fact that was done behind closed doors in secret definitely had a big impact in terms of the foundational legitimacy of government by the people, for the people in the United States, and created a sense that that's something that is not directly participatory. It's a little bit more kind of removed, right, from the people. It's interesting you note, that today, of course, there's still a lot of secrecy in our government in the United States. You were noting committee hearings or processes. Of course, there's also, a lot of things that happen in unofficial spaces, right? Outside of even committee rooms, but kind of in private settings. And then you also have a vast kind of bureaucracy, right? The administrative state, where there's a lot of spaces where things are not done publicly. So it's certainly there, but today we tend to see those spaces as more the exception to a general expectation that things are going to be done publicly. And I'm kind of tracing the origins of that, a shift toward that expectation. So I would say even in the United States, even early on, starting in the 1790s, as we head toward the 19th century, there is more and more of a demand and expectation that government work will be done in public view. And it does kind of expand over time. But of course, I talk about this in the book, as you expand, public access, that also pushes a lot of activity to these other places that are not public, right? So it kind of, as you expand the realm of transparency, it also creates new avenues, right, to do things in secret, or it can push things into other spaces. So it's an ongoing kind of balance, as you note. And, every so often it really flares up with certain issues where it becomes a real flashpoint or concern. That something is done or formed in secret behind closed doors. Other times you have people raising it as, maybe we should do this, whatever it is, behind closed doors, that might lead to a better result than doing it, on television live, essentially. So yeah, it's an ongoing tension and an ongoing debate.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, obviously there is transparency, now in the current era, but there are still, like you're saying, elements that are kind of done behind closed doors, and it's just interesting to see, kind of at the beginning, how it very much was a lot of that, and obviously, yes, there was a big push to not do that, but it is an interesting dynamic. It's also interesting to see which issues historically and currently are still kind of secret or are, more public. It's interesting to see how those things kind of, fall into place there. So you mentioned in the beginning these differences between representative government and democracy, which is, I think, important because, I think a lot of people get this mixed up. So what do you see as the differences here between a representative democracy or government and democracy? How are they similar? And how is representative government, kind of legitimate as, kind of by and for the people, initially at least?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think today we tend to kind of take for granted that representative government is a form of democracy. It's the most common form of democracy in practice in the modern world. And so it's easy to just kind of take that as natural, that of course that is a democracy. But what I try to do in the book is go back to the late 18th century, which was a moment when the term representative democracy actually came into being for the first time. So as you have reformers and revolutionaries kind of thinking about government in this period, democracy and representative government were considered distinct. Those are two different things for them. So often when they're talking in the 18th century about democracy, they're talking more about an ancient form of government, like in ancient Greece. The idea being that all citizens participate actively in government, more what we might think of as direct democracy. And pretty much no one in the 18th century thinks that that's feasible in the societies they're living in. Their polities have become too large, too complex. No one's really advocating for that. I won't say no one, but pretty much no one is really advocating for that. So then the question becomes, okay, we need to have representative government in order to have some kind of government by the people. And there's sort of a debate that emerges about that, where you have some people who see representative government as sort of a necessary evil in some sense, just because direct democracy is not possible. Representative government is sort of the next best thing we have. And so to make it legitimate as a democratic form of government, what we need to do is ensure that representatives reflect the population, that they consult their constituents, that they do their best to carry forth the popular will, what the people want. And so that's kind of their idea. And then on the other hand, you have others who look at it and say, representative government it's not an imperfect solution. Actually, it can be an improvement upon direct democracy. And we should see it that way, that actually what that allows us to do is to let the people elect the most virtuous, the wisest men, for them it's men in society, to come together and deliberate and form the common will amongst them, right? And do what's in the best interest of the people, such that they might arrive at a better decision than the people themselves would arrive at if they all could be kind of convened together. So you have these kind of two competing views of how to make representative government sort of a form of government by and for the people, and it's kind of in that kind of jostling of those two ideas that the representative democracy is formed, and both of those ideals kind of still exist within the concept, and we haven't fully settled how we want it to work. And I think that in my book, I try to recover that there's kind of multiple ways of thinking about representative government and how to make it democratic, or what we mean by that when we say that it's a form of democracy.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things there. So we'll obviously talk about England, obviously, because a lot of this is, why did they decide to do it this way? It's kind of in response to how they had been governed as colonies. But if the counter here is not representative democracy sometimes tipping into not mob rule, but that you can give too much, like too many opinions is not always a good thing. The counter to that is like, well, we don't want just a handful of people making decisions for a large number of people, with elites and things like that. And so how do they kind of wrestle with these things, right? You talk about representative government maybe as a tool of popular sovereignty, but I don't have this view of, generally, as we say it, democracy as, this kind of, idealistic thing that we should all strive for and everyone around the world should have it. I think there's downsides to democracy. And I think that too many people having too many opinions and too many voices at the same time, you're just never going to get things done a lot of the times, right? Or you're just going to be very slow. So I guess how did the founders initially, how did they wrestle with these ideas of, again, you're talking about a small amount of people, right? I don't know if they ever really foresaw 330 million people in 200 years. So, that's another discussion to have about that. But for however many people it was in the 13 colonies, maybe the expansion of it after that, how are they trying to wrestle with this idea of like, too much or too little? Why not have this pure form of democracy, kind of like in the ancient way? Why are representatives needed as a way to tell this popular sovereignty kind of story? What was the kind of mindset, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you have conflicting views on that. So you have revolutionaries, framers who are taking different approaches to this question, and kind of see it in different ways. So, like I was saying, pretty much everyone agrees that some form of representative government is necessary. They don't really see a direct democracy as feasible, even in the among the 13 colonies becoming a country in 1787. Just that it's not going to work. Those impracticalities that you're talking about, that they're too overwhelming, that would descend into kind of anarchy. You have kind of one side that views it as, okay, so we need to have representation. But what we should do is ensure that those representatives are really tightly bound to their particular constituencies, so that they have to come back, be at home, often with them, know what their life is like, interact with them, solicit their views on everything, and then go back, to the capital and convey that and represent that in that sense, right, in making decisions. But then you have this other view I was talking about, where you have, and this is particularly true among the kind of people who become part of the Federalist faction, who take a different view and really have even more skepticism, I would say, of democracy, and sort of think, like Madison says, well, if we make actually a bigger sphere, a bigger republic, we can kind of let the people elect their representatives, but then we kind of insulate those representatives. We can have fewer voices, like you were saying, contributing to determining what's in the best interest or common good, right? And that actually they will be better at doing that because there are fewer of them. They can come, they can deliberate calmly, they're educated, they're wise, they have that independence, and for them, that independence comes from owning land. So again, they have a lot of assumptions and kind of prerequisites to people being enlightened or being able to serve in this role that we don't share today, which I think is also something that's created a lot of tension and kind of challenges as the country's grown and developed. But they have that kind of idea that you're expressing, where it's sort of like, well, there's only certain people who are really qualified and certain conditions that actually lead to decisions being made in the best interest of the population. And it's better to kind of limit that rather than trying to have it as big as possible, right? And to go out and talk to as many people as possible and attempt to translate that then into the best interests of the people, or kind of this statement of common good.
So just to be clear, a direct democracy would be just that, where everyone literally is there. We take out the representatives and we just directly to the people. That's just not tenable. That's not feasible, and nothing's ever going to get done. Things don't get done the way it is, at the moment. So, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that obviously makes sense, but I guess was there ever any ever any point of, well, this might not work? Because you're obviously, when you're trying to represent a local community, let's say, right, you're going to miss some people out, or some people are not going to get represented, right? And at the time, this is white dudes, of course, right? They weren't looking at women, and they weren't looking at people, minors necessarily. They weren't looking at slaves and natives. So whatever. I mean, that we take what's there at the time. So, but still, I mean, it wasn't. This is another thing when it outgrows that, right? And now it does include all of those groups. but, I guess how much of those ideas mm, can they I don't want to be cynical here, but can they outlast how things evolve, right? I mean, when you really look at the country, it's people, a small amount of people, relatively speaking, that were, homogenized and or homogeneous, and they, as you get more numbers, and then you get more people, and what the ideas were. Well, does do we outgrow the idea or the structure of it? Again, I'm not an anarchist. I'm not calling for any. I'm not saying. I'm really asking, like, how do this might be a rabbit trail, so maybe I shouldn't ask this, but take something like the Electoral College, right? Now, I don't know how well versed you are in the Electoral College or anything, but many people have decried this, and this is antiquated. We shouldn't do this anymore, and whatever. And it's usually the losing side of an election says this. We don't need this anymore. Mm-hmm. The winning side says this is fantastic. This is great. And I don't know. I'm not one of those people. I think the Electoral College should be reformed. I don't think we should not have it at all. But that's an example of like a concrete example for listeners to be like, yeah, maybe there are things that we outgrow and we need to update, because the founders were only looking at folks up and down basically the Eastern Seaboard, and then a certain amount of people. And it's much different when you have different people, different groups, different histories, bigger space, more numbers. What do we think about that in terms of representative government being able, if it can, to evolve with some of those other features?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raised some of you're getting right to the heart of it. I think these are a lot of the challenges and kind of questions that we're facing as a country today. We're living in a framework that was created in a time very, very different from our time right now. And I mean, you're mentioning demographically, geographically, also technologically, we could bring that in. I mean, the speed of communication, the methods of communication, all of these things, very, very different, and in many ways, unanticipated, right, by the people who actually wrote this document that governs us and sets up these structures. So I think you're absolutely right that we're testing that, we're pushing the bounds of that, and I think those are some of the biggest questions that we face. What holds, what doesn't? How do things need to change? How does our thinking change? What stays similar? And what can work? At the same time, I think there are some core challenges that were challenges even at the time, even within those very limited frameworks that they were adopting. So like you were saying, their notion of who they're representing is very, very limited. It's limited to white men, and in most cases, white property owning men. So it's a very, very limited population. But even within that circumscribed group, they still face these questions of, well, what does it mean? Should we give power of making laws and proclamations and setting up structures? Should we give that to the few? Right? Should that be more concentrated among the small group, or to the many? And even within that circumscribed group, there's a challenge of figuring out really who are the many, who are the people. How do you know what they want? Even if you're talking about, a district that's not very big, and if you're only limiting who has a voice to white men, for example, even that, it presents challenges where it's sort of like, often when you're hearing from the people, you're hearing only the loudest voices. I mean, again, these are things we're familiar with today. You're hearing only the loudest voices. There's a lot of voices you're not hearing, right? And the French case, which I look at in the book, kind of shows some of the dangers of that extreme. If you rely too much on public opinion or the many. That's fundamentally a really difficult concept to invest power in, because it's really hard to actually definitively get at what does the majority want, and we have more tools to do that today. Like we have, public opinion polling. We have this kind of stuff. But even with that, it's very, very difficult to actually definitively say, what does the majority of the people want or think about any given issue? So yeah, these challenges have become even more difficult as we've gone forward, grown, incorporated more people, more viewpoints into our concept of representative democracy. All of that, I think, is for the better, but it definitely puts strain on these things and brings these questions to the forefront. These challenges that existed even way back with a much narrower and smaller vision of who the people were and where they were located.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, when you think about politics, right? What it means is how do we get a group of people together to decide how they want to live in society together, right? I mean, that's really what we're asking. But this is something I think about all the time. I think even if the United States was more homogeneous, let's say, right? Let's I don't want to pick any race because then everyone's going to hate me of whatever race I pick. It's just one race, let's say, right? Like kind of like how you have in Scandinavian countries or in certain African countries or wherever. Pick your country that's your favorite. Just the numbers piece of it is difficult. I mean, which is maybe a bigger question for sociologists or something like that. But we come from small tribes and small groups and things like that. But how do you get everybody on board for many, many, many people? I mean, that's really difficult to do. Again, I'm going to sound like, man, I really sound really extreme today. Look, you can say what you want about India and China, right? You can say whatever you want about those countries. I have no idea how you manage a country of 1.4 billion people unless you have some type of, I don't want to say authoritarian, but there is a very top-down approach, I would say, in those places. There's no way direct democracy, representative democracy works in a place like that. How could it? How you have long histories and long lineages of people, just all these different religions, different things. And these places are old. These places are thousands of years old. I have no idea how. I'm not saying that the way it's done now is correct or whatever. There's obviously horrible things and that goes on in those countries. But how do you keep something stable? So that's 4 times the amount of people we have. Like I don't know. You know what I mean? Like it's. And when you have a country that is very diverse, very heterogeneous, and relatively young, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know how that works. And I think that there are components maybe of representative government and democracy that work here in the country for sure. But I certainly think that there are plenty of things that don't. And I guess this is kind of to your point, right? Of the book is. There's a problem with making the founders and making the Constitution, almost quasi-religious, right? Of this.
Yeah.
People did at the time, I guess, with George Washington and stuff, and maybe Jefferson a little bit. But like we have this idyllic notion about, we lionize these figures, right? And look, I mean, Washington and Jefferson are cool. I mean, they're fallible men, but they did some cool stuff, right? They made the country who we are and whatever. Okay, cool. We treat the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, like it's a fifth gospel, like it's divine from heaven on above. It's not. People rewrite constitutions all the time. Now, some write it every single election cycle, which isn't right, or they rewrite it to stay in office, right? I mean, you can look to many countries around the world that do that, and that's not probably that good. Too much change in that way is probably not good. But so obviously there's imperfection everywhere. But I guess like how to figure that out? It just doesn't seem to be. There's no model. There's no there's no way, I don't think, in which to do that. And again, that's not me being against diversity or anything like that. I think it's just more of, it's super complicated to actually do something pragmatically and efficiently for many people. There's no model for that. And I think that it's extremely hard to do. I don't think it's impossible. And I don't think some of the things we have now are bad. I think they're really helpful, but so I'm not too sure how to do that. But another question here is where we came from, right? It was very much, King George sucks. We don't like him. We want to do our own thing. We want to have, all these rights and, free speech and, right to bear arms. I'm thinking of all the first 10 Bill of Rights. And, what was it about those when we were colonies, right? You talk about the Stamp Act of 65 and the Middlesex election and all these things. But what was it that they thought that going from colonies to states, you can talk about that shift, but why that shift and why they thought the way they could do it was better? What was the rationale coming out of that context of a monarchy and all these things? It's like, we don't want that. And even people would argue, we didn't want Hamilton or Washington to be a type of, monarchy by a different name. So what's the context, I guess, in which we're coming out for these things?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the grievances that American colonists have going into the American Revolution are born of a lot of the same kind of challenges that you're just talking about in the contemporary world. They're living in an empire. They are separated from the government that is governing them by an ocean, right? They are far away. And so you mentioned the Stamp Act. I mean, that's just one of a series of policies coming out of London that many of the colonists, and this is important, not all of the colonists, but many of the colonists, right, are upset about and feel are a violation of their rights and their interests. So basically you have, though they lay this ultimately at the feet of King George III, right? Their beef is really with Parliament. Parliament is the one making these policies, passing these policies often that they're very upset with. And they start to look at that and say, we don't even send anyone to Parliament. We don't vote for any members. We don't have anyone there voicing our interests or our concerns. Now, the response coming out of London is, yeah, well, so neither do a lot of people in England itself. That's not how our system works. These members of Parliament are here to determine the best interests of the nation as a whole. Edmund Burke says that. He says, we're not just here to convey, particular interests from each little constituency we come to and then battle it out. We're here to think about the nation as a whole and to govern in its best interest. Well, the colonists start to look at a lot of these policies and they start to say, I don't think we share the same interests as you. I don't think we share the same interests as the nation. And so, this, they talk about an imperial crisis. This is part of that imperial crisis, which is say, how can you have a one community that is being represented in this way that spans an ocean that is an empire, right? And so that's kind of where that's coming from. You have a lot of these colonists looking at it and saying, not only do we not send any members to this legislative body to convey our interests, but you're saying, we don't necessarily have to, that body has our interests in mind. And, we're actually starting to question and think, we don't have the same interests as you have back across the Atlantic. And so this just isn't going to work. We need institutions that represent our interests, which are local and are based here and can possibly be in opposition with your interests, back across the Atlantic. So that's kind of how that conflict emerges. And again, it raises a lot of the things that you were just raising in contemporary societies, like very big nations. A lot of these same questions are coming up in this imperial conflict that leads to the break between the American colonies and the British Empire.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to other historians about prior empires, the Ottoman Empire comes to mind quickly, mostly because that was until modern day, 600 plus years. You can think of many empires from the past. There's a lot of terrible things empire does. So, no three cheers for empire, but there are some things that they do well, which is governance and administration. And, the Mongols did this, the Ottomans did this, many places around the world have done this in the past, again, different times. And much of it was out of, fear and all that. So there's some obviously tremendously, awful things. But that's one thing. I mean, you still have to manage it and govern it day to day. So I don't know, maybe 1.5 cheers for empire or something. I don't know. But there are, again, I'm not standing for empire. That's not what I'm doing necessarily. But I do think that what lessons can you extract of how do you manage, many different people groups over huge swaths of land over decades or hundreds of years? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a question there, right? It's a question. And so we have colonies to states, right? Why are we states, right? All those things. And then, but also there's this idea of in that process, right? In Congress starting to figure that out, you talk about in the book is this idea they did all in secret. Now, when I was reading this, I was like, oh, well, I could kind of get that. If you don't want the British to know, right? Or if you don't want spies to know, or if you don't want this getting out to the press, because then it's, then they're going to figure out what's happening. I could understand some of the secrecy, right? You're not going to do this in, right in the town square. And, I could get some of that, right? But it doesn't seem like that was the only reason that they were doing things in secret, right? So maybe just talk about this kind of the core of what you're saying in the book is in the formation, as we're moving from colonies to states and how we want to have a country and all these things. Why did we do this and what were the multitude of reasons of why it was done in secret initially?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, like you were just saying, it's multifaceted, right? It's a complicated situation. So part of it is that they are rebelling against the government that claims authority over them, right? So, like in that sense, they're meeting in secret strategically, like you're noting for maybe like military diplomatic purposes, of they're going to be facing an army, right? An invading army, so they need to like have some way of coordinating and planning that's not open or visible to the enemy that they're fighting, right? So there is that element of it. But another element that I talk about in the book is also that they're meeting among a divided American population, right? Like I was just mentioning earlier, not everyone's on board with what they're doing, and you have a sizable portion of the population that remain loyal to the British Empire through the war. So they are also going there and they're trying to project kind of a sense of unanimity, right? Trying to speak with this unanimous voice in a context that there isn't a lot of unanimity, actually. So it's strategic in that sense. I mean, in another way, it gives each of those delegates kind of cover as individuals who could face recrimination from the British, depending on how things go militarily and what happens. They're sticking their necks out in that sense too. So doing that as a group with kind of one voice also gives them some degree of protection as individuals, right? Who are actually doing this. So you have that sense too. I mean, so there's some strategy there. There's some, you might even say, kind of paranoia or just kind of like necessity, circumstantial necessity of being in soon after they start meeting, being in an open war, right? In a conflict. But then there's also a sense of what kind of body they are, right? What their mission is, what their purpose is. So initially the Continental Congress is conceived of as a temporary body to come together, convey their grievances to the king, and seek redress, right? And these delegates are sent with instructions to do those things and then kind of disband. And they're not elected by the people of the colonies. They're sent by often these kind of interim governments, and then the state governments going forward, to convey the interests of their state, right? So they almost often are viewing themselves kind of like ambassadors from individual states, kind of coming together and then coordinating this policy, and as things move forward, a war effort, right? A diplomatic strategy and a military effort. So you also have that kind of sense. But at the same time, I saw in a lot of their writing as they're meeting throughout the war, they also have this anxiety or this sense that they are speaking for the people. And often there is this kind of concern, they don't want to get out too far ahead of public opinion, for example. Like they also are concerned to know, do we have a critical mass of support to do any, thing that we're going to do here? Like they know that they need enough kind of public backing if what they do is going to stand, right? Or is going to have any legs. So, this is maybe most true in the lead up to when they declare independence. So a lot of the delegates really drag their feet on that. And they're just really anxious. Like, we need to go back home and see if people really want this, right? Before we can do it. They don't want to get out ahead of public opinion too much. And they are worried about that. And so you can see over the course of the war, there are a lot of critiques that start to emerge of the secrecy surrounding Congress and how it works, because it's becoming a more permanent body. It is acting on behalf of an American people, however nebulous that is. And that leads to a lot of questioning of what that means for how they should actually work, and what the relationship between that body, that institution, is to anything like public opinion or kind of the people writ large.
Yeah, it's interesting, kind of what you're saying there about kind of getting ahead of not wanting to get ahead of public opinion. Is very, very interesting. So you mentioned the book, and we haven't really talked about it. So you give this kind of contrast to what's going on in France, right? So maybe tell us, kind of at the same time, or kind of right around, kind of in the same sphere of things, how this looked different in France. In France, it was more public, right? There was these kind of much more public in how they were trying to do things. You can talk about the revolution of 71 to 74 and having publicity with constitutions, wherever you want to go with it. But just kind of give us, the kind of at the same time, a different way in which this was going about elsewhere around the world.
Yeah, so in France, you have their revolution breaks out in 1789. So we're seeing, a decade, a little more than a decade after the American Revolution had broken out. And the situation, the context is very different in France. And that contributes to some different decisions getting made about the use of secrecy or transparency in these deliberative settings where decision making is happening in these revolutions. So whereas the Continental Congress is kind of convening for the purposes first of conveying these grievances to the monarch, and then ultimately breaks with the monarchy and is managing a war for independence, in France, it's not really the same in that sense. So you have the Estates General, they come together at the invitation of the king, actually, to convey the population's grievances to the monarchy and trying to implement different necessary reforms at that time in France. And as soon as they come to, there's a lot of tension surrounding this. And as soon as they come together, they pretty much immediately transform themselves. They proclaim themselves to be the National Assembly, and they say that they're not going to disband until they write a constitution for France. And so they are not, unlike the Americans at the beginning of their revolution, they're not fighting a war of independence. They're not telling the king that they're getting rid of him. In fact, they are trying to work with the king. They're trying to reform the government, create a constitution. They envision that constitution, most all of them, envision that constitution will retain a monarch. And that's what they're doing. So that's a different situation. They're not in an open military conflict. They're not breaking apart from the state. They are trying to work within that state to change it. Right. So that is kind of a different dynamic then. So they're, like I said, they're not in an open military conflict in that way. So there's that element's kind of removed. And then the king and the monarchy in France was so associated with secrecy and was so criticized for that. And it had sown so much distrust that it would have been really hard. I argue it would have been really hard for these deputies to close their doors and meet in secret because there was just so much suspicion of that, so much discrediting of secrecy as it was associated with the monarchy, that would have been really hard for them to do. Secondly, I argue that they didn't really want to do that. Most of them didn't want to do that because for them, in the situation that they're in, having the public present, aware of what they're doing, for them, that's empowering. In the case that the monarchy, tries to come in and shut down what they're doing, it puts them in a position to kind of court public support to, the more that the population, the public knows what they're doing and is part of that process, the harder it is for the king to snuff it out, right? And shut it down, which he does try to do repeatedly in that first summer that they're meeting. So it's just a very different context and set of circumstances and challenges that those bodies are facing when they're making those decisions and when these revolutions are getting started in that period. So yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting how it is different. I wonder if the difference is because the age of these places, right? So, very much the United States or whatever the colonies at the time were the New World, right?
Sure.
But France had been there for a while. And I wonder if this was just something about, why it's different, right? Why it's, they both have monarchs. They both have, obviously England and France aren't the same, but, there are somewhat similarities in structures there and just the way in which it was gone about. I just wonder if there's something about the age of these places that are different. The colonies hadn't been there for that long. At that point, it would have been what, 100 years?
A little more, 200.
A little more?
Yeah, 200. Yeah.
So, you haven't, and how much of it was developed at that time? There's still a lot of underdevelopment. So it very much still feels like, virgin soil, right? This is kind of like, the whole thing. Whereas France has been there for, thousands of years, right? So I wonder how much of that is a factor there of why they did it different.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I mean, you're right. And in one sense, if we think about the American colonies as kind of young, and we're talking about the English colonies, right? I mean, there are obviously like Native American communities that are living in these places for a really long time. But if we're thinking about like the English colonies, it hadn't been there as long. They're also operating with a lot more autonomy for a long time. For a long time, the empire is sort of allows them to mostly deal with their affairs, and they do govern them in particular ways. But after the 7 Years' War, they really implement a lot of new policies and they attempt to really centralize and implement greater kind of control. And that is what spurs a lot of these conflicts. So that is definitely something that's different, that distance that we were talking about and kind of those things. But I mean, in another way, when we talk about France is there for a really long time, yes, and it does have a lot of institutions that are very old or have a long history, a lot of social structures that are deeply rooted and these kind of things. But in terms of France, the modern state, we also, it is important to remember that is also something that kind of is getting created like through the 18th century. They also have a lot of provincial distinctions. There are a lot of different dialects and kind of languages that are spoken. And it's really only, leading up to and especially through the revolutionary period going into the 19th century that it becomes much more centralized and conceived of as a nation state. So in that way, we can see some similar kind of processes that happen coming out of this period, the creation of these kind of nations and more of a centralizing, kind of putting it into a national government, these kind of things.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So let me go back to Madison, because you brought him up earlier. So you talked about the second part of the book about how secrecy was a procedural but also a practical decision, and how he tried to create these speed bumps, right? Not necessarily roadblocks, of ensuring that majorities kind of, were able to go together over time, and that they were founded in reason, and that this is very, very interesting. You were talking about earlier as well that with representative democracy with Madison, that there's like an even smaller insular kind of government as well within that kind of representative government. Because since we're kind of here talking about the kind of logistics of it, what was he trying to do with these kind of roadblocks, or excuse me, speed bumps of sorts, to try and, that the secrecy part of it was important for, kind of pragmatic reasons, and he wanted things in reason, didn't want it to be kind of, irrational or things like that. What was the kind of play here?
Yeah, so Madison, when he comes into the Constitutional Convention in 1787, we're just talking about the American Revolution. These are states fighting for their sovereignty, right? So often when we talk about the revolution and we kind of go from the revolution straight to the Constitution, there were a lot of years in between those things, in between the end of fighting and the adoption of the Constitution. And in those years, the action is really happening in the states. And a lot of focus is on that, how the states are set up, how they're running. We've probably all heard about the weaknesses of the Confederation Congress. It can't tax. It's kind of facing all these challenges. So Madison's coming out of that period, and he is looking at the situation, and he starts to get really concerned about how representative government is functioning at the state level. And he's really concerned about the state legislatures. And he looks at that and he feels that there is kind of what he and others call an excess of democracy in these state legislatures. In other words, that they're too reflective, they're too responsive to pressure and kind of public opinion. And he's particularly worried about this in the realm of monetary policy and tax policy, fiscal policy, where you had these legislatures like issuing paper money often because people were complaining that they couldn't pay their taxes, right? They didn't have, and there's an economic crisis going on at the time. So Madison's coming to that. He's concerned about that, and he's sort of thinking a lot about these questions of how can you ensure wise policy? How can you protect minority rights? And in this case, like the minority he's thinking about is creditors, actually. But how can you protect these rights? How can you ensure wise decision making? And for him, his grand theory that he arrives at is the extended republic theory, right? That actually one way of doing this will be to have a larger republic, because that's going to mean that you have bigger districts. Representatives are going to be able to feel less immediate pressure from their constituents. They're going to be more prone to, the people are going to be more prone to pick the most virtuous and kind of qualified men to go and deliberate. And then he kind of views distance itself, or time, the space that creates, as giving those representatives the ability to calmly consider things over time, to not make rash decisions, to not be constantly, having to go and consult or worry about what people out of doors, are going to be wanting them to do, and that they'll be able to go deliberate and arrive at a measured, considerate policy that in his view will be the better policy than if they were facing all this kind of noise, for lack of a better way of putting that. And so to him, I kind of write about in the book how secrecy, meeting behind closed doors, having these deliberations without a public presence, is almost another tool to create that kind of space, that kind of time, distance, and just kind of insulation. So he goes into the convention thinking a lot about this. Of course, he comes out on the other side, and once he's in Congress, he changes his mind actually about a lot of this, which is really interesting. But he goes in with that kind of idea, and those kind of concerns.
So it's interesting. He's quite creative, isn't he? He's got a lot of outside. I mean, for the time and for his age, and he's very interesting. His evolution of evolution of thought is very interesting as well.
Yeah.
So I guess just kind of to move it along of what ends up happening here is there's this sort of, I mean, not entirely this way, but there's kind of a shift on both parts in the United States and in France. So, you talk about some of the issues with France and their publicity going all the way up to Louis XVI being publicly guillotined, which is wild. It's a wild story. And how they were like, maybe publicity isn't like all that great. Maybe we need to kind of scale that back a little bit. And then the reverse in the United States, again, not at the same time, but, within the preceding years, during Washington's administration and even Adams' administration, there's still secrecy that goes on in how they conduct things, of course. But that there is more of a push of, I think, once you get to, Jefferson, especially after the election of 1800, which that's a whole other thing about that being done in secret as well. That there was more of a kind of, okay, maybe more public using certain documents, using public newspapers. How do we be a little more transparent? Again, it didn't happen overnight, but that there was more of that kind of push. Because again, it's an interesting contrast and compare about, France is kind of downshifting on the publicity, and America is kind of upshifting on publicity and downshifting on secrecy. Because you talk about kind of how it evolves over as we get into the 19th century.
Yeah, so the book kind of charts how these two countries take, like you're noting, almost kind of opposite trajectories moving in France. In France, for example, they move from much more publicity, openness, toward a reintroduction of secrecy into the government. And that happens especially through the period that we know as the Terror. So the Jacobins, which is the faction who become leaders of the National Convention during the Terror, they had always been real advocates of transparency, of this kind of reflective style of representation, real advocates of that. Once they become leaders of the National Convention, they are establishing this republic. The king is gone, right? They're in a republic at this point. There's a constitution that's put together that still enshrines all of these things, that guarantees all of this publicity, but they immediately suspend that and put that aside and say, it's not possible to do any of this right now because we're in a revolutionary moment. And essentially what they kind of say, or what their actions speak to, is this sense that the people aren't ready to govern themselves. So during this period, you have the formation of the Committee of Public Safety. They meet entirely behind closed doors, very, very secretive, and they're kind of calling the shots, running the show. And it's all kind of rooted in this idea that it's a temporary necessity. Until public opinion is educated enough, is ready to make the right decisions, what they consider the right decisions, we have to do it this way. We have to adopt this more insulated style of representation. We have to use secrecy. And it's really interesting. I mean, in that respect, they have some similarities to Federalists in the United States who hate Jacobins, right? Who are, totally disavow them. And that's because sort of their visions for society or what they want to do, they're very different, very, very different. But the methods that they adopt and this kind of vision of representation, for a moment at least, is quite similar, which is very interesting. But so you have that in France and the Terror. There's this real lockdown and kind of return to secrecy. When the Terror ends, when Robespierre is overthrown, the Terror, that period kind of ends, and you move forward in the late 1790s. At first, there is kind of a backlash against that, and there's a push for greater transparency. There's kind of a concern like, hey, there was too much secrecy and look what happened. This is bad. But very quickly, you have a shift to saying, no, actually, that was all because of transparency. All that actually happened because of transparency. And they're kind of able to do that because these Jacobin leaders continued to use that rhetoric of transparency being very important and this kind of reflective style being the way to go. While in practice, they're not doing that. Right. But because they continue to say that that's important, afterward, it's still easy to kind of associate them with transparency and kind of then carry on the secrecy. So we see a lot of these secret elements, the kind of reintroduction of secrecy that Jacobins had brought into government as sort of a revolutionary exception or kind of exceptional measure, you see a lot of those things actually continue after the terror in the government. So in France, going through the late 1790s, there's still a lot of secrecy. You start to see even sort of a positive theorization for the use of secrecy, which is something you just had not seen before. And then you have Napoleon Bonaparte, who comes along, right?
Yeah.
And his regime very much relies on secrecy. It's not claiming to be a representative democracy in any sense, but it's this strange situation because he relies very much on publicity, and kind of publicity in the sense of propaganda, of broadcast of a particular image to the people, and association with the common man, and kind of building this trust.
And
so
that's why we're still talking about him and making movies about him, because
exactly,
it's very effective.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the trajectory in France. It's very messy, it's complicated, but generally toward more secrecy and kind of the instantiation of this form of publicity or transparency that is very much a kind of broadcast, a controlled broadcast to passive spectators. At that point, going into the 19th century. In the United States, you have kind of the opposite. I mean, we were just talking about coming out of the Constitutional Convention. There's a positive theorization for the utility of secrecy to a representative government. And you see that carried through the Washington administration, like you said, through the Adams administration, that, actually it can have a positive role for leading to good policy outcomes. And it can serve to kind of insulate the government from public opinion in cases where public opinion might not seem to agree with the policy that the government is pursuing, but that those in power feel is the better policy. So like Washington relies on it quite a bit while he's in office, particularly in trying to navigate the conflict between the British and the French, and steering a course of neutrality, and then kind of establishing a treaty of commerce and amity with the British. Washington is pursuing at points policies that are quite unpopular if you look at kind of the press petitions that he's getting, but he views those as the best policy, and he uses secrecy strategically to kind of insulate those decisions and make that more possible, to kind of divorce the foundational legitimacy of the government from having to constantly seem like it's mirroring or agreeing with public opinion. So there's a lot of use of secrecy early on, but it definitely gets critiqued. It gets critiqued a lot, and it gets critiqued especially by the opposition that starts forming. As you know, Thomas Jefferson is a major figure in that opposition. Madison, like I said, he kind of changed his mind. He becomes a major figure in that opposition. And so you have these pushes for greater transparency, opening the doors for the Senate, for example, which happens in the mid 1790s. So you have kind of this, and by the time you get to 1800, Jefferson coming into office, he's very much about, I'm ushering in a period of greater transparency, this more reflective style of representation. But oddly, there's some ways in which he is not totally consistent on that. His actions are not totally aligned with the way he talks about these things. And in some ways, you have a similarly kind of performative publicity to what you see in France. Obviously, it's not to the same extreme at all, but there's some ways in which the very meaning of what we think of as transparency or publicity in the government, in both cases, in the course of this revolutionary period, the 1790s, that kind of gets transformed into something that is more about a controlled presentation of information, or kind of, sites of politics, that is, more intended to be kind of broadcast to a passive audience of spectators. Kind of, it's been a little bit voided of some of the more participatory intentions or hopes that kind of thing had, as people are advocating for it. So yeah, opposite trajectories, but in both cases, you also have kind of some similar redefinitions of what transparency really means, or what people mean by that when they're engaging in it.
Yeah, it's an interesting wrestling match is kind of how I see it. So one of the last questions I have for you is, we still care about this. We still care about transparency and secrecy and all this stuff. And I just think now in the United States, I think really in most nation states now, but you need a different way of talking about that and dealing with that when you have the internet and when everybody's got a phone in their pocket on their camera and everyone has access. If I play my cards right and I get enough followers on social media, all of a sudden I got thousands of eyeballs looking at something, and there's incentives for that, some good and bad ones. That's much different than, I don't know how much. I'll say I don't know, but I'll kind of say I don't think that we should be that transparent. I'll be I'll be a little definitive on that. I just don't think you can contain that, even if, like, I don't know, I have like less than 5,000 followers on Twitter or whatever. Like, I can't imagine, like, renting out like a music hall or whatever, right? That's got 5,000 people in the audience and just putting my thoughts up. That's literally what happens, right? Ostensibly. What happens when there's millions of people, right? So I just think this idea of like transparency, it sounds nice. We don't want people in smoky back rooms making decisions for millions of people. I understand that. I understand the fear. You can't trust government elites. I get that. I understand that. At the same time, I don't think the answer is some delusional libertarian idea of, everyone can do things on their own and we just got to directly from the people or whatever. No way. I mean, that's just chaos. That's chaos. So I go back to what we were talking about in the beginning. I mean, you're the historian, right? You tell me. I don't know. How do we have this balance of transparency and secrecy? And then I haven't even said anything about the various players involved, right? You could take someone like a Mitt Romney or a John McCain or, Barack Obama. And you say, look, I don't agree with them on their policy stuff. Yeah, I wouldn't do this. Yeah, they're a little bit too whatever. But that they're, good citizens. They care about their country. They love their country. And they're not going to create horrible, or they're going to try not to create horrible human rights issues for people in the country and outside the country, at least to try not to. The cast of characters nowadays, I can't say that confidently, right? Yeah. And so then it becomes another issue, right? Because who are the actors here, right? Transparency and secrecy and all these things, they do work, depending, I think, sometimes on who's involved. And then this is a bigger reason. This is another conversation, but this is a bigger reason why institutions, you see this all the time, institutions need to be, they're not static. They're ever evolving, and you need good people in them. But in theory, they should be bigger than a person, right? Because then you just have cults of personality. Then you just have people that can't establish, and that's important. There's going to be someone before you. There's going to be someone after you. You're a caretaker of sorts, and you can have power, but it's how you wield it, etc. But if everyone's saying institutions suck and they're all terrible, well, that's dangerous. That's completely dangerous because, again, you're going to have way more chaos. So all these things to say, based on the history, what can history tell us or teach us about, how secrecy or transparency or publicity, should or can evolve in at least in the United States or, in representative government?
Wow, that's a great question or a set of questions. I mean, I think if history did have the answers, hopefully they'd be much more in demand, I suppose. But I do think what it can do, and I don't know if this is encouraging or not, but I think what history can do is basically just help us to see that everything the way that things are today, these situations that we're confronting, that they came to be from a particular set of circumstances, challenges, experiments, failures, and that understanding that and actually digging into that can help us at least try to step outside of our current moment and situation and try to see it from a different perspective, from a broader view. So like you were saying, this consideration that secrecy, we don't want decisions being made in back rooms, closed door deals, this kind of perception that all secrecy is threatening or dangerous to democracy. That's something that is also born of a particular historical moment, and it comes from, has roots in the late 18th century, and it's become such a dominant view that it's difficult to really even think about it in a different way. Now, of course, secrecy can be dangerous. It can be threatening to democracy. It's not always good. We need to be careful about it. And like in terms of how it's wielded, a lot of that also depends on who is wielding it, who is using the secrecy, what kind of decisions are they making. And as you know, that's hard, right? Like when you have people that you don't trust who are using these things, then your suspicion in it is very warranted, right? Now, on the other hand, I think we can see the origins of kind of transparency coming to be seen as this like solution to a lot of these problems, as a way to foster trust between elected officials, between government and the people. And it can serve that purpose, definitely. But I think through researching this book and kind of thinking about this historically, one thing that I've come to question or think about more is just the ways in which it doesn't always have that outcome, and that actually there can be sort of unintended consequences or negative externalities to transparency or to publicity. And I think that, we're confronting some of those today in the situation that we're in. Just doing things in public view doesn't make them good, right? or more democratic or okay. And I think that, we're kind of contending with that now as we think about the role of, turning politics or viewing politics as kind of a spectator sport, and kind of having that intense media attention focus on politicians all the time, that it's not necessarily leading to more democratic or better outcomes. So I think we need to think about those things going forward.
Yeah, I fully agree with you there for sure. I guess the thing I was just thinking about when you were saying that is, I don't want to have to always distrust my representatives, right? Like, I don't do that job for a reason. I don't want to do that job. Like, I don't want to go and like plan and organize like how we should do things for like my district or for my state or whatever. That's what you're there to do it for, right? So if everyone's always distrusting of that, you're never going to have anything, right? That doesn't mean that people are going to be infallible. Yeah, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to compromise. Maybe 1,000 people in a district are going to hate it, but the other 6,000 like it. All right, well that's what it is, right? You can, that's how it works, right? I don't. This idea, and again, I go back and lean on the institutions of things. Is like, I get really worried on both sides of the political spectrum here in the U.S. Really talk about institutions in ways of we got to burn it down, or we got to start new, or we got to. Sure, sometimes maybe, but I'm all for reforming institutions mostly, or reforming with then maybe the goal of building something new and better and replacing it. Okay, fine. But you don't just take it out and you have nothing else there. And I think that doesn't get us anywhere. Again, more chaos. So I guess the last question is how can democracy die in darkness if it was somewhat created in darkness, right? How does that work, right? What's this kind of this major lesson, I guess, for your book of saying like, yeah, there's definitely some non-transparency or secrecy and how, the great country was created. Why should we continue to know that? What can that teach us about democratic lessons for today?
Yeah, a few reasons. I mean, that was kind of the starting point for me of this book. I mean, okay, we kind of take for granted this idea that democracy dies in darkness. Well, if we think that's true, how do we explain that in the United States it was born in darkness, right, behind closed doors? And I think confronting that can be uncomfortable. I think it can make people uncomfortable to confront that because it just seems to not make sense, that it can't really hold up. But I think doing it tells us a lot about what democracy means and how it was constructed, what it looks like in the United States. And I think we need to reckon with that, that it kind of forces us to clarify what we mean by a democracy, what we actually mean when we're using that phrase. So I think that's one way. And another thing that I think is important in investigating this question, or kind of taking that on, considering that, is just that, is it possible that darkness, secrecy, is not entirely antithetical to democracy, that it has a role to play? And that whether you think it's a good or a bad role, that it's, promotes or diminishes democracy, I think that's open for debate. But I think what I try to show in the book is that it does play some role. And we have to reckon with that, and we have to actually confront that and think about that if we actually really want to understand democracy, how it works, how we want it to work, and also what we think about these questions of secrecy and transparency in our government.
I totally agree. It is part of our democracy. And the question that I think about that when you bring that up is, yes, it's a part of it. And that just means that we have to trust people and what they're doing. And we don't do that anymore. So
yeah, it's fair to say. I don't know if anyone ever, really did. I mean, it waxes and wanes, right? Maybe. Like there are points when there's higher trust, points when there's less. But
I'm not saying this kind of 100%. I think there should always be a healthy amount of, questioning or criticism or keeping people honest, for sure. But generally, I think there should be a space of, well, this job requires this, or, you're, smart enough, or you're, competent enough to do this. Okay, I'm gonna keep you honest, but, I think that's what that is. And so when people have to do things in secret or less transparent, that you trust that they're not, trying to have any, do anything negative for the greater good of the society. But it does feel like we're a long way off from that. But, I
think it's hard. Yeah, I think it's hard for people to do that. But you're absolutely right to identify trust as the central element in the functioning of a democracy. I mean, it's really essential. And when it's not there, it's not going to work very well.
Well, that's just it. I mean, that's just, if you want democracy or some version of it, you have to have trust. And if you don't have that, then you're not going to have really growing, edifying democracy, which is, maybe that's not the way, but you got to find another way of doing it or whatever. And so it's all of these questions that we continue to wrestle with, and this election year in 2024 will all be more very proximate on our minds. So this should be a lot of fun. The book is called Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy and Transparency in the Age of Revolutions. Katlyn, this was so much fun. I love talking about all this stuff. And you wrote such an exceptional book to really think about the United States and how it was formed, and really looking at it in a different way. And so I appreciate your work that you do, and the book, and everything that you have going on. So a big thanks for coming here and talking about all your work.
Thank you so much. This was a really good time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.